Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to Finance, Audit and Risk Committee on the 31st of January 2024. I'd like to welcome members, officers and members of the public watching at home to this Finance, Audit and Risk Committee. The committee plays an important role in the overall governance of the Council. Good governance has many benefits, including helping the Council to make effective decisions, improve performance, and be able to respond to risks and opportunities. Before the meeting starts, I would like to invite the committee member and scrutiny officer to explain how proceedings will work. Chanel.
Thank you, Chair. If a member wishes to speak, they should use the speak button located on the microphone unit. Please wait for the Chair's invitation before you begin. When requested to vote, voting will be via the yes, no, abstain buttons on your microphone unit. Details of how members voted will be shown on the screens around the room, and the result will be visible on the YouTube stream. In the event of a tied vote, the Chair will have the casting vote. Are there any questions before we start? Thank you. I'll hand back to the Chair.
Thank you. Apologies for absence. I've so far received apologies from Councillor Terry Tyler, and Councillor Tamsin Thomas will be late tonight. No, he hasn't. Are there any other apologies at all? Okay. Minutes from the 13th of December 2023. I'd like to propose that we take as read and approve as a true record the minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of December 2023. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Hone. Are there any comments on the minutes? Nope. In which case, can we move to the vote, please?
Chair, that vote's carried.
Notification of other business. There is none. Chair's announcements. In accordance with Council policy, this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be available both on the Council's YouTube channel as well as on the Council's ModGov site alongside the documents from this meeting. Members are reminded to make declarations of interest before an item. The detailed reminder about this and speaking rights is set out under Chair's announcements on the agenda. For the purpose of clarification, 4.8.23a of the Constitution does not apply to this meeting. Therefore, a member may leave the room during the debate and consideration of that item and be able to vote. However, please be mindful of the business on the agenda and, wherever possible, leave at an appropriate point in the proceedings. Public participation. We have no public participation this evening. So move on to item number 6, SIAS Progress Report 2023-24. Hand over to Chris Wood to present.
Thank you. The lights come on. Thank you, Chair. Couple of things to discuss. I'll just pick up a few highlights. Table at 2.2 on page 17 indicates which final reports we've issued since papers were last presented to you for the November committee. You'll see a repeat of freedom of information, which you had between the date of the papers and the last audit committee, and I think we had some questions on last time. Safer recruitment is a new one you will have seen in digital strategy. You probably weren't copied into the Workman's Hall and the King George V playing fields. Both are simply independent examiners' statements and not traditional assurance opinion reports. However, should you wish to see copies of them, they are available. 2 high priority recommendations are contained in this report. The one on risk training you'll see has been implemented and I understand was presented to your last meeting, which I wasn't at, but for completeness from internal audit's point of view is repeated here. And the disaster recovery high priority recommendation actually had a revised implementation date of today, although I'm not certain whether it was actually completed today. And we'll report on that one again in the next papers. One of the things we have to do as the ultimate owners of North Harts' plan is communicate any amendments to the plan, although they're none to report. The bit I propose to dwell on slightly longer in this report, 61 days into the delivered of the audit plan, 46% of the projects, but somewhat behind the profile where ideally I think we should have been at, based on the one of the appendices, which lays out which quarters we propose to start the work. Number of reasons for being behind the profile. As ever, it takes both the authority and its internal audit team to deliver projects. And a number of factors have arisen, including a somewhat back-ended audit plan. We had 8 pieces scheduled for Q4. However, a couple of pieces have also been deferred from earlier in the year. That's both initially at the start of the year, capacity challenges for the shared internal audit service, but also capacity challenges on the side of the council to support those internal audits. There's been competing service priorities. I know some services have had other external reviews and consultants in. A couple of teams have been audited continuously throughout the year, and there's a little bit of audit fatigue. Been some delays in getting audits mobilized, getting evidence through, but a lot of these factors are interlinked. If you struggle for capacity, you'll struggle to mobilize an audit. When I was here in November, I mentioned that I was cautiously optimistic that we would deliver to our PIs. I think that's going to be a challenge now. However, for the fourth quarter often has a momentum of its own. As I said, in November, all audits have been allocated to audit staff. However, if audits don't start when you need them to, that resource will be redeployed to another partner within the science partnership, where audits can be moved. We're working with those teams to get the work done. There was an exit meeting on the critical applications audit this afternoon, I believe, which we finally managed to have. So that particular audit reporting should take place imminently. Number of audits and field work and happening right now. So we're expecting that to move on. The key ultimately is when I come to this committee in June, have we done enough work to support your annual assurance opinion, which is where we need to be. There's still more than enough time, all things being equal, to deliver that assurance opinion. I'm not seeing any limitations on that ability at the moment, and enough audits are in progress and should be finalized by then. So just communicating that now, and as I say, with this continued support of the authority. No, I'm not seeing an anti-audit culture or a lack of support for internal audit. It's more about that capacity and resource. This is a council that has a resourcing risk, and this is one of those arenas where that plays out. It's I think your risk register has resourcing at 8 as a red risk, and that's not uncommon for local authorities. You see it right across Hertfordshire and other local authorities, but it's how do we work with those teams to make sure we still continue to deliver those audits. As I say, it's not something I necessarily see the audit committee needing to intervene on. It is a part of the role of the audit committee to make sure that the council and its audit team can deliver the assurance that you need. But I'm not seeing this as a cultural issue at all. I think the support for internal audit remains, and we continue to enjoy the support of the services and vice versa. It's just continuing to work successfully together. Take any questions.
Thank you, Chris. Go to questions now. Councillor Hone.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chris, as well. Yes, I can understand your concerns about that we are a little bit behind on the schedule. We did get warning of that in the previous meeting, which we discussed. And as you said, you assured us that we would probably be where we wanted to be by the end of the term, and so you could issue the assurance commitment in June. Just if you can, just confirm to us here that you are assured that you will be where you want to be by the end of the term, and that you'll be where Ian wants you to be, or should I say the Service Director Resources wants to be, at that period. And the question therefore comes on to Ian, or to Service Director Resources, to say how confident he is that he can support your team in getting to that stage. Thoughts, please.
Thank you, Councillor Hone. Enough audits have commenced in delivering the remainder of the audit plan. It's about driving them through in the right way, such that we arrive at a point in June. If you take that, we can support that assurance opinion. I'm confident where we stand now, as reasonably as I can be, all things being equal, continued support, that we'll have delivered enough work to support that assurance opinion. Some of that work will slip over into April and May. So we have performance stats that take us to the 31st of March. But the key for any audit team, regardless of cut-offs such as year end, is that when you arrive in June, usually you have enough work done. And at the moment, I'm confident that that will be delivered. Certainly with the resource available from our side, needing the continued support of the council and its officers as best they can with the challenges that face them. And I openly acknowledge those. I've experienced them myself. I'm part of local government.
From my perspective, I share Chris's confidence. I think I've pushed with other service directors and other service managers how we move audits forward. I think we've worked together with the various auditors and with the Chris Wood to make sure that we found ways to deliver audits that both benefit staff and the organisation, but also mean they can get done. So we've kind of looked at different ways of shaping how the field work will work, to ensure that we can kind of resource them to the best we can. So I share Chris's confidence, but we'll obviously be keeping an eye on it, and we'll be pushing if I see any of it slipping.
Thank you.
Thank you both there. Are there any further questions? John Cannon.
Thanks, Chair. The client satisfaction surveys that are discussed in the table on page 5 of your report, 19 of the pack, these surveys can always be a bit of a blunt instrument. I noted that on the right-hand column, it says you've had a satisfaction rate of 50% out of 2 surveys returned. I just wondered, could you elaborate on that? Is that meaningful or just not a representative population anyway?
Unfortunately, that figure hasn't actually changed for about 3 audit committees now. So a separate question incoming, John, to your original question, is how we drive up the number we receive to get a more representative sample. It's a challenge a lot of teams face. Nonetheless, on the 2 that are in there, I suppose the assurance I give you is that we look at the feedback. It goes into a particular auditor's supervision and performance appraisal, usually not punitive, more about helping them learn and all the rest, unless it's part of a consistent pattern experienced across multiple customer satisfaction surveys across our partnership. But in this instance, I won't go into the specifics, but it actually only missed being satisfactory and by a single point on our scoring mechanism, and they scored quite highly in some areas, but had the knock-on effect of a couple of other areas being scored quite quite low. I think some of the feedback there probably relates to some of the things we've just been talking about around resourcing. When you've got stretched staff, you actually need to be quite efficient and effective in the way that you work with people so that you don't sort of overstay your welcome but get the assurance you need. And you can sometimes fall foul of that. You might create a little inadvertent friction, and you may get some feedback, but we have to, it's part of our own continuous improvement to take that feedback at face value and pass it, either pass it back to auditors, or if the criticism relates to me, then I need to review that as well. I'm pleased so far that hasn't been the case in the latter, but it could equally apply to me and perhaps the way I'm supervising a particular piece. So yeah, it's I think for me the greater challenge right across our partnership at the moment is getting that greater representative sample by having a larger proportion back. Absolutely.
These things happen, and no systemic problems, nothing to signify a closed door to internal audit.
No.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I was wondering if I could just ask a quick one. Obviously, we've talked about resourcing already somewhat at length, both in this committee and in previous committee meetings we've held. I just wonder if I could ask about the, obviously having BDO signed on as part of that resourcing package that you've been using alongside the internal SIAS resources, just how that is going at the moment, if that is helping to alleviate some of the concerns, and if that is leading to, I suppose, a greater rate of completion than would have otherwise been the case.
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely. So BDO, as you know, are procured as our external delivery partner, and they exist for the very reason of providing resilience to our team, right from SIAS's commencement in 2011. We've had a partner for that purpose, and we have an allocation of work which isn't fixed every year. It very much depends on when it's needed and how it's needed. It's on a call-off framework, and there's no dedicated number of days we promise, although they seem to get a fairly consistent level of allocation. And yes, we allocate work to them right at the start of the year, so that they can help us deliver. We don't just wait till there's a problem and then allocate the resource, although we may, as issues emerge, issue them with more work as the year goes on. So yeah, a key part of delivery. As you can imagine, it does come at a cost though, and the sort of one's own budgets have to be managed, and how much work one allocates them within our existing budgets. It's currently cheaper to recruit one's own staff, considerably cheaper than the rates of external providers. So we do like to allocate to our own staff as far as possible, but if you've got vacancies, you need to spend the money from the vacancies on your resilience.
Thank you. And one final one on this, just in terms of the sort of, I suppose, level of what's being found and what's being returned, just in terms of, benchmarking, I suppose, maybe the wrong term, but in comparison against other local authorities in terms of the findings and also following through on those actions. I was wondering if you could potentially, make any comment on, again, knowing that the relationship does seem to be working fairly well, but the overall performance there, and whether or not you feel those recommendations are being followed through on.
So yes, there's not been an issue that I'm aware of in implementing internal audit recommendations at North Herts at all. I think there's a strong culture here. We report on the high priority ones to the audit committee. The medium priority ones are recorded on Pentana and have regular follow-up within the authority. So I don't see, and I'm not aware of any issue at all with the engagement with our recommendations and implementing them.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions from the committee at all? If not, the recommendations for this item are that the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee notes the SIAS progress report for the period to 12th of January 2024, notes the implementation status of the reported high priority recommendations, notes the plan amendments to the 2023-24 annual audit plan. Could I have a proposer, please? Councillor Plater. Thank you. And seconder. Councillor Hone. Thank you very much. Move on to the debate. Is there any debate at all? Okay. In which case, can we move to the vote, please?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Item 7. Investment strategy, integrated capital and treasury. Hand over to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to start by suggesting that when we come to the recommendations on this, we make a slight change to them. I feel that probably in the way it's worded, we've probably lost the referral on to Cabinet. What I was trying to emphasise in that recommendation is that the importance of this committee providing comments on the report, but in doing that, I think we've lost the actual recommendation to Cabinet. So when we get that, I propose that whoever proposes it changes the recommendation to that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee provide comments and recommends to Cabinet, and then the points 2.1, 2.2 would then follow that. So I'm proposing that's there. I mean, the thrust of what's proposed is still there, just making clear the recommendation is there. So in terms of the report itself, I'll focus on the cover report, albeit that all links into the more detailed Appendix A, which is the proposed investment strategy. The purpose of the investment strategy overall is to cover our capital programme. Then that in part determines what cash are available to invest as part of our treasury management strategy. And the two link together. The more you spend on the capital, the less cash you've got, and therefore the less you have to invest. So that's why they kind of join together into one document. If I start off in section 5, as members are probably aware, we have the budget workshops, which are sort of closed sessions in early November to discuss proposals both on the revenue and capital budgets for the coming year. So that's the starting point. And then 5.1 and 5.2 show the kind of evolution from there, because as they happen in November, things do change and do get added in during that period. So on that basis, 5.1 details three changes that were discussed before it went to Cabinet to approve the kind of the consideration of those member workshops. And then 5.2 was a verbal update provided by the executive member at the last Cabinet meeting in terms of a number of new areas for capital investments. One of those is relation to waste vehicles and increasing the estimate there. Now we're kind of a bit further through the waste procurement process, getting nowhere near final tenders yet, but getting more detail from bidders as we go through the kind of dialogue process, a better idea about what the likely cost of those waste vehicles will be. So added that into the capital programme, and more probably slightly high, but prudent estimate what the waste vehicle costs will be. In relation to the other three on that list, they're essentially all investor save items. We are looking at adding capital to generate revenue income. So in relation to the first one, it's a case of we provide capital funding that the leisure contractor would otherwise have provided. Because our cost of capital is lower, we can generate some revenue savings out of that. The next one's around the proposal for a learner pool at Royston, subject to a business case, but looking like there might be a chance that there will be a viable business case there in terms of generating enough demand from that to offset the cost of capital. So adding it to the capital programme in case that transpires. And then finally, the kind of third bullet point down relates to the hope that we will get some funding from the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund, which provides substantial contribution towards heat pumps, solar panels and solar thermal on our leisure centres. So again, hopeful that will more than cover the cost of capital with that contribution. Without that contribution from that fund, we'd be nowhere close to covering the cost of capital of those investments, which shows that there's still some way to go to decarbonise and get the technology in place to be able to do that without that supporting funding. And then finally, 5.3 notes that the decision in December Cabinet in relation to changes to the way waste collections will work means that there's a allocation for new bins for fibre, for paper and cardboard, whilst the expectation is that will help to manage the cost of the new contract because that will be a more efficient way of collecting that material. Section 7 talks about the capital programme from that's going through this year. We're going to do at the moment, and you'll see the monitor reports on those before they've gone to Cabinet. So just reflects on the fact that that's where we are against delivering that capital programme, because that provides some of the starting point for the capital spend for the following years. With the additions that I've referenced in Section 5, we do have quite a high capital programme proposed for next year. And the full list of the proposed capital programme is attached at Appendix A1. So there's lots of detail there around all the various capital projects that are proposed. And then turning to the actual investment strategy itself, pages 2 and 3, as noted there, sort of provide a kind of an index, a contents page for the report, which I'm not going to go through every bit of, but I'll pick out a few key areas from there. So looking at things like Table 10 looks at capital receipts. As I've said, probably this committee quite a number of times, our capital receipts we have at the moment are declining as we spend our capital programme. They're being spent faster, they're being replaced. And we will naturally get to the point next year whereby we will run out of capital receipts. That has happened probably a bit quicker than maybe we were expecting. We've had to look at the point at which we'll generate capital receipts, and whereas we had some forecasting this year, actually that's been severely reduced, and a lot that's been pushed in sort of 2 years' time, which reflects both, again, back to that resources points about resourcing the estates team, but also reflects the state of the housing market at the current time, and it's probably not quite the right time to be disposing of land for housing. So yeah, those receipts are delayed, and that delay does obviously mean that we will have less capital receipts to use for our capital programme next year, albeit that by the time we get to the end of that period, we'll get to the same level of capital receipts in total, but the delay does kind of trigger into that. Paragraph 8.6 refers to because we ran out of capital receipts and are therefore essentially borrowing to fund our capital programme, which is perfectly normal. Many authorities in that place. We're still a relatively low level borrowing compared to some authorities who have very high levels of borrowing. We do to consider how we fund that borrowing. There are two ways of doing that. One is to borrow externally, which is where you actually go out and get more cash and pay interest for the privilege, or you can borrow internally. So this is different to funding capital from our reserves, where we actually allocate the actual money and the actual budget to that capital programme. You just use the cash that is sitting there in the short term to fund that capital programme, rather than getting that cash externally and going out sort of to get a loan to that extent. Because we've got quite high level reserves, which are made of both our general fund reserve, our specific reserves, but also our provisions. We've got the cash sitting there, so we can borrow against that. The advantage of that is that the cost of that is lower in terms of the lost interest from that money being used. It is lower than what we would pay for if we went externally to borrow that money from other institutions, other local authorities, other banks, or from the Public Works Loan Board. It's also beneficial in terms of when we do need to go externally borrow, we'll have to push that down the line a bit to when interest rates are a more lower level, and can therefore that longer term borrowing will be at a lower cost for ongoing. So that's the principle there. We are still required to charge a minimum revenue provision, which is spreading the cost of any capital expenditure over the life of that capital asset. And therefore we've got a minimum revenue provision policy set out in the investment strategy in order to do that. And that's covered in paragraph 8.7. All that flowing through determines how much cash we have available to invest. And obviously we have a strategy to invest it to make sure we consider the security and liquidity of that cash first, and then after you consider that, to think about the yield. Historically, over the last few years, we've generally had quite a stable level of forecast balances across the year, and therefore we tend to use the year-end balance as the basis for setting the investment limits. Because it's looking like quite a decrease across the year, we're proposing to use the average of the cash balances to set those limits. That's made so that we don't end up at the start of the year when we've got higher balances trying to put money into too many different places, because of the effort and work involved in that. So trying to get a happy medium in relation to that. Because of that, I don't want to be overexposed in any particular asset class by the end of the year, I've suggested in paragraph 8.8 that we do actually reduce some of the percentage limits across some of those investment categories to kind of compensate for that, and to try and get the right balance between not having money in two different places, but equally not being overexposed in any one place or any one class of investments. So that's kind of the detail about the fundamental principle that's going on. The report then goes on through paragraph 8.10 to 8.15 to talk about kind of some of the detail of things we'll be asking council to approve in terms of our detailed processes in relation to treasury investments, and they're set out there. And there's obviously a lot more detail in the report in the appendix A as well. But if I leave it there and take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. Questions? Councillor Hone.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Ian, for your. So the way I understand it is, if you like, we're borrowing our own money. Really, we're borrowing from our revenue reserves and using that for our capital spend, and that exposure to the revenue reserves, of course, provided we meet statutory minimums, which we have to do. So just confirm that is the process which we're going through, and meet the statutory reserve minimums that we obliged to keep.
Yes, that's the process we're going through. We're not actually, whilst we're using the cash in those reserves, not spending those reserves. So at the point at which we feel that our cash levels are too low, there are provisions in there to then externally borrow. Not expect that to be in the next year, but over the next few years, we will get to a point where our cash balances are too low to maintain our cash flow adequately. At that point, we'll then swap that internal borrowing for external borrowing.
All right. And would we swap the whole lot that we've already put from the revenue reserves as borrowed, or will we just borrow the difference that's outstanding that we need?
We would look to borrow the difference to what we need, but looking to, when we do start going external to borrowing, looking to manage our longer term exposure. So what we look at is borrow at the right rate to try and reduce the cost of that borrowing, looking at kind of our medium term need to borrowing, and also getting a spread of maturity dates so that we're not exposed a particular maturity date around being exposed at that point to any excesses around borrowing costs at that point. So there will be kind of some quite detailed strategy work around how we borrow externally when we need to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hone. Any further questions from the committee at all? John Cannon.
Thanks to Service Director Resources for discussing some aspects of the details with me on the phone the other day outside the committee. Just for the purposes of the committee, please, just to recap on some of that conversation, where the council will be helping to fund some of the contractors' spending, but whether by releasing funds to buy vehicles or gym equipment, etc., the assets will indeed stay with the council on its balance sheet, not on the contractors. And secondly, the scale of the capital programme and the borrowing requirement is not currently thought to place such additional strain on reserves that it will compromise future ambitions around things like Churchgate and the sustainability of the council.
So in answer to the first question, yes, we would, as a result of those mechanisms, we would definitely be capitalising those assets. In essence, there are rules around capitalising assets where you haven't funded them as well. So we currently capitalise the waste vehicles, even though they've been funded by the waste contractor. That's on the basis that we get on the benefit of those assets. They're there to deliver our services, even though they're owned by, even though they're physically bought by the contractor. But where we fund them directly, yes, they'll definitely on our balance sheet. And there is still that question around, for the new waste contract, do we fund the vehicles directly, whereby we pay for them, because there might be a saving out of that in terms of our cost of capital being lower than the contractors, or do we let the contractor buy them and then we capitalise them because we're getting the use out of them? But the end result still the same in terms of where they sit on balance sheet terms. To answer your second question, which was around sustainability and being able to deliver priorities. So as and when we get a detailed plan for Churchgate, and assuming that's a regeneration that involves capital expenditure, that would increase our borrowing requirement, because that's not currently factored into our capital programme, albeit any business case for that would consider the revenue impact of that and made sure that we can cover the cost of that borrowing, etc. And that links us to the wider point around sustainability. The whole point of things like the investment strategy and the minimum revenue provision is that you make sure your capital programme is sustainable, because you're looking at the implications of that capital programme on your revenue budget and how that all feeds through to make sure you've got a revenue budget set that maintains your revenue reserves and delivers a balanced revenue budget.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on the minimum revenue provision, there's a number in the pack, but as I understand it, it's not a number that we are looking to reach. It's a reference point rather than a budgetary tool. And in reality, we don't intend to hit that limit for the foreseeable future.
So in terms of minimum revenue provision, that is our current estimate. If we were to spend our entire capital programme as forecast for the coming year, that is the amount of charge. You don't charge minimum revenue provision the first year, you charge it in the second year and thereafter. So if we spend our entire capital programme as set out in next year, then in the following year, we need to make a charge based on that capital spend that was unfunded from capital reserves. And that, based on that, is the forecast of what that will be. If there is capital slippage, it will reduce the amount of minimum revenue provision we have to charge, because that's based on actual spend, not on budgeted spend. So there are obviously elements in the capital programme that have tended to slip over time. So if that happens again, then that would be the knock-on impact of that. But it is prudent to estimate based on spending the capital programme. That's what it's there for. And that's what's therefore reflected in the revenue budget when you kind of see that charge move across from the capital side into the revenue side.
Thank you.
Councillor Hone.
Thank you for letting me come back. I've now got a few other items, which, if I can, please. Page 48, Churchgate Shopping Centre, Hitchin ground lease there. We think that the asset is worth 4.5 million. Is that an external valuation of that asset? That's one question. Would you like all the questions or all at a time?
I think it's in previous, if we could, depending on how many there are, do them in batches of about 3 and then give a chance for response.
Okay, that's the first one. The second one is that the public sector decarbonisation fund, if we don't get that fund it's a big chunk of the money, more than half it, do we ever see that project actually happening? That's the second one. The third one is on page 58, that we have this table there, and I think you'll find that there's an incorrect number on there where it's got Public Works, PWLB, Public Works Loan Board. We have a number of 25,12340. I think that should be 25,000, shouldn't it? It's only a typo. So based on that typo, and then the final one is Stevenage Leisure, the equipment. And I get the impression from what we've written here, we don't expect to get that money back for the equipment that we loaned them. We don't expect that loan money back. Can you confirm that to be the case, please? Sorry there's so many, but
I've got my pencil out that time, so I write them all down. Churchgate, yes, that was an external valuation. That was the valuation we had when we purchased the asset.
So that's not changed, sorry.
Has it changed? It may actually, no, it would have been investment policy, would have changed. It would have been updated since then, but it was based it was done externally again based on the previous valuation, but it was done externally, that valuation.
Thank you.
Public sector decarbonization fund, we would still go ahead with the solar thermal and solar PV aspect of it. So solar thermal at Royston and solar PV on all those centres, because they've got a payback that makes sense in isolation without the PSDF wider capital allocation. But the heat pumps themselves would be currently too expensive to do without that funding. We will then have to look to sort of defer that to a later date when hopefully the technology's moved on, or there's more rounds of grant funding to enable us to do that one.
Thank you.
Yes, type on that table you mentioned.
Please, I'm ready.
That, we'll get that corrected. In relation to the equipment, I have concerns about the fact we'll get the money back from that loan, but all at the same time we'll obviously trying to do all we can, as we would do any money owed to us, to get that money back. But we have set aside a bad debt provision against it. We did that last year, so that will mitigate some of the impact of that. But yeah, we'll be in conversation with Stevenage Laser Limited towards the end of the contract to see what they are able to pay back to us, and how we kind of recover as much as we can out of that.
And you can keep us informed if that happens, please.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hone. I suppose just one for myself, based on some of the conversation we've had. I was wondering if you'd be able to, Ian, maybe set out as to why the initial move would be to look to borrow against, as you mentioned, but borrow even internally or externally, rather than potentially use a general fund in that instance to fund some of these items. Just to be clear in terms of the strategy and setting out what the plan is there.
I mean, fundamentally, we can't afford just a general fund. The general fund is there for revenue expenditure, and capital expenditure by its nature is generally much higher than your revenue expenditure. So you look to spread the capital expenditure over the life of the capital asset. So your charge against the general fund each year is much lower, and you've got to mitigate that impact. If you're trying to fund your borrowing straight from the general fund, which you can do, it is allowed. You're allowed to fund borrowing from fund capital expenditure from revenue. It's just basically unaffordable.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions from the committee? Yes, John Cannon.
Thank you. Drawing a link to the revenue budget paper and also to my previous question, which was a little clumsy because my machine has lost the notes that I made on the paper the other day. In the revenue budget paper, there's a minimum balance for the general fund recommended at 2.48 million. And it was, in fact, that was on my mind. That, as I understand it, is a minimum balance that's going to be kept as a reference point, and it's not actually a low point that's intended to be hit. It's more what could happen, a worst case scenario, if all this spend happened at once and some of the risks were crystallized. Fair?
I'll answer it now. That's probably more relevant to net support, but I'll answer it now. When we're talking about the recommended minimum balance of the general fund, that is the point at which our general fund balance has gone too low. It is not a target. It is not an aspiration. It is something that should be avoided. We should always be aimed to be above that. If we get to the point where we are forecasting to go below that, that is when we are into Section 114 territory, and I'm saying we can't set a balanced budget, because that is then where the ability to kind of work on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis being compromised.
So the capital program as it stands does not take us into that territory.
Well, I mean, the implication of the capital program affects the revenue budget. The revenue budget has savings targets. Some of those savings targets are driven by the fact we've got higher capital investment, albeit some of that capital investment is therefore offset by some revenue savings. If we fail to deliver the revenue savings in that target, yes, we're at risk of going into below minimum value of the general fund balance. So it kind of does, but kind of doesn't. I mean, I'll come on to the other next report around how key it is to deliver that savings target, because that is what is going to take us too low if we don't deliver it.
Thank you very much. Just check for any further questions at all from the committee. And if not, I hope I've written it down correctly. So with the changes suggested by Ian, the recommendations are that the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee provide comments and recommend to Cabinet on this strategy and in relation to Cabinet's recommendations, which are that Cabinet recommends to Council that they approve the adoption of the investment strategy as attached at Appendix A, including the capital programme and prudential indicators. This incorporates the changes referenced in paragraphs 5.1 to 5.3. That Council approve the adoption of the 4 clauses in relation to the Code of Practice on Treasury Management as detailed in paragraphs 8.10 to 8.16. Does that read correctly, Ian?
My proposal was shorten it even more than that. My proposal was to have it as that Finance Audit and Risk Committee provide comments and recommends to Cabinet, and then go straight on to the bit where it says 2.1 approve. So then you go to the Cabinet recommends to Council that they then 2.1 onwards.
Okay. I don't think that changes the meaning too much. It just cuts out some more that I have to read out of Cabinet, which I'll be very grateful for. So on that basis of those recommendations, could I please have a proposer? Yep. Councillor Plater, thank you. And can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Thomas, thank you. Can we move on to debate? Is there any debate from the committee? Don't see any. If not, we'll move to the vote, please.
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you. Move on now to item 8, Revenue Budget 2024-25. Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. So the first bit is going to be similar to the last report. As members will be aware, we started off with the budget workshops back in November, and they made recommendations proposed onto Cabinet of their comments, and then Cabinet considered those at the meeting in December around where they go with those and what proposals to take forward. This report then goes into a lot more detail around where we go from there and the risks and consequences of those decisions. So as I noticed in the capital report and set out here in paragraph 8.3, there were some additions proposed by Cabinet at its last meeting. Some of those are purely capital, but I noticed here on the basis that capital additions have implications for the revenue budget as well, as we discussed under the last report. But there are some ones that are just revenue implications in there as well. So they're set out in paragraph 8.3 of the cover report. We then go on into the general funding section, starting at paragraph 8.4. So noting that we started off with a policy statement and then a draft local government finance settlements. And then after that, there was then an announcement by government that there will be an increase to the minimum guaranteed increase in core spending power up to 4%. And that is now been reflected in the numbers. I'm stalling slightly because I just realised this is I'm looking at the wrong version of the report. So I should say, please look at the addendum version of the report. I think would have been. So if I just, that should be on there. So yeah, the addendum version. So far, report 24-25 addendum is the key one to look at. So that does reflect in the paragraph at paragraph 8.5 around the announcement from government around the additional increase in core spending power from 3% up to 4%. So that's in paragraph 8.5. And the tables then therefore reflect that for this year. That number is of 173,000 additional funding in the coming year. Has not been confirmed by government yet, albeit the people we get advice from in terms of how we work out these numbers have confirmed that number to us. So it's probably a pretty good estimate, but we'll wait for the details about that probably in over the next week or so as to what that number is precisely. They're usually pretty good at getting these things right. We'll update the papers as we need to reflect that. In terms of forecasting for future years, that is set out in table 2. That is an estimate, as I'll come on to a bit later. There are a number of ways to estimate what our funding will be in future years. In the absence of any medium-term financial settlement, we are reliant on just using our best estimates as to where funding might go. I am still taking the assumption, to be prudent, that there may be an impact from a new funding formula that's negatively affects authority on the basis there doesn't appear to be much new cash around for local government, albeit slightly tempered by the fact we had the announcement about the increase in the core spending power to 4% rather than 3%. And obviously there are much greater pressures on social care authorities compared to districts, albeit the pressures on us are pretty huge. So that equivalent negative revenue support grant is still in there as a forecast, but with some protection for a funding guarantee, which means essentially end up with flat cash in terms of funding over the 5-year time horizon. When I come on to the appendix D, I'll talk about a bit more detail about what I mean as a better or worse scenario. In setting the budget, we need to consider the impacts of other sources of funding. So table 3 looks at our grants we get in addition to sort of general grants and sees what the state of those are, because obviously there's shortfalls in those. They have a knock-on impact in terms of funding from having to be met from our general funding. And then I think it's important we look at our specific reserves. That's in table 4. And that looks at other sources we've got to fund various projects or various ring-fence money that's been set aside for particular purposes. As we set out the forecast there for those reserves. And you will also note that the impact of some of those not through into our previous report around our balances available for investment, where those funds are quite high. Paragraph 8.117 also notes we have money set aside as long-term provisions and the positions on those. And then the next section of the report considers what is our minimum level of general fund balance that I recommend as your Chief Finance Officer. And we formulate that in a sort of a combination of ways. Part of it's based on the percentage of our net revenue expenditure. Another bit of it's forecast based on our budgeted income, given that we do have risk around income, and therefore we should reflect that in kind of setting a minimum balance. And then it looks at specific risks, and that's set out in say paragraph 8.20, and also in appendix A is the full detail on those specific risks and the potential financial implications of those on a low, medium, high basis. It's also important at this stage is to make sure we've got the kind of position for this year as accurate as possible, and also if any impact of that on future year's budget. So table 7 is a kind of although we only just finished the kind of Q2 monitoring process, a further update on that to kind of take into account the latest position on those budgets. So that's reflected there. And you'll note we've got some ongoing impacts that are quite high. One in relation to care line, which is quite positive, the first lines of that table, but then some knock-on impacts in terms of parking income, a negative impact there, which has an ongoing impact in future years. And that's just bringing that forecast income down as it looks like the recovery post-COVID is probably kind of stalled or is about to sort of start stalling, and therefore we'll probably hit this kind of a plateau in terms of level of income we'll get back to. As we've just been talking about, the capital side, 8.24 and 8.25 are the impacts of that flow through from that report into this budget, and see the numbers there. And then Appendix D is a detailed review by myself of statutory requirement after a Section 25 report, which is a comment on the adequacy of the estimates and risks and assumptions in the budget. So it's quite a sort of a reasonably long appendix that looks at the various things that are affecting the budget and where there's uncertainty about them. And I suppose it's up to this committee to kind of have a view around the detail of that, because that is kind of one of the remits as far as about looking at the kind of risk of budget setting and provide that kind of comment onto cabinet and then council around around your views on that. And then the cumulative impact of all of that is set out in Appendix C, which sets the savings target for future years. And that is quite the key bit really, in terms of if we are to maintain our budgets, we do need to make quite substantial savings, and we're able to deliver those savings in future years. So there is a need for the administration to kind of consider what the options are in that regard. So that's the instruction report. Obviously, there's a lot of detail in there, and have to take any questions around any detail in there.
Thank you, Ian. I'll now open up to questions from the committee. Councillor Hone.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you again, Ian. A couple of just poses really. I'm on page 12 because it was an attachment, which is table 7, summary of forecast variances. Hertfordshire County Council's Careline income. Is that all the funding for Careline? Do they fund it completely? Or how much do we fund at Careline?
So overall, the service covers its costs. So it's a combination of income from the county council for some of the support that I suppose is in relation to social care clients, which helps to avoid those clients ending up in being high level support social care need. But there are private clients as well who receive an alarm, and I suppose provides reassurance there to themselves and to relatives that they have something to fall back on, and they fund that themselves. So that's a monthly charge to the people who have that equipment. So it's a combination of private clients and the county council clients as well.
So how much does Careline cost NHC?
The overall cost to us, to North Hertfordshire Council, is zero, in that it breaks even.
Thank you very much. Can I continue, if you mind? Previous papers put before us indicated that on addressing the funding gap, there was a number of things that may need to happen, which was being able to generate additional income, being able to generate income from commercial activities, and reducing the level of services that we provide on. Has any of that been built into this budget, or are we holding those things still around for the 24-25 years?
I mean, there are things set out in the savings on there. I mean, there's quite a few savings in relation to Careline, which is quite positive in terms of they're kind of doing better at covering their costs, which is why we can move that position whereby they are fully covering the cost of service and contributing towards overheads as well. So yes, there are savings in there, but there are more areas of savings to look at as we move into next year's budget for the 2026-27 budget. The activity happens in 2025 to both address any funding gap here, which is set out in the report, but also any implications of the new waste contract and any increased costs there. So when we know more about that, we can then look at what the extent to which we need to be looking at those areas to bridge that gap, both kind of initially in response to that initial potential shortfall in funding, and then the ongoing funding that arises because of, we have this kind of inflation lag whereby we're spending more than funding we've got at the moment, and that might get worse as funding sort of fails to keep track.
Thank you. And finally, if I may, Chair, the previous leisure contract, Stevenage Leisure, the arrangements in place there was of a charitable organisation, which therefore had some exemptions around VAT, I seem to recollect, which was advantageous to us and to them in terms of cost. Are those similar things in place with the new contractor, or don't they apply in these circumstances? Because the impact on this budget.
Yeah. So Stephen Limited have the benefit both in terms of VAT and also business rates. So shouts exemption in relation to that as well. I think it's fair to say that I think all the leisure providers have a similar status in terms of how they are able to minimise their business rates costs and also minimise their VAT.
And so we will get that similar status with the new contractors as we did with Stevenage Leisure.
Yeah. So any savings from that are built into the contract price they bid to us, and therefore, yeah, we would benefit from those.
Okay. I just want to make sure that process that there's done different within the new within the old one, that we weren't therefore losing out, or we're not. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hone. Are there any further questions from the committee? John Cannon.
Thank you. I particularly liked the Appendix D. I thought it was very helpful, actually. Question, please, on the comments that note that the reserves are at an adequate level for now, but if action is not taken in worst case scenarios, the reserves could fall very quickly. Comments, views, rhetorical question: is the council sufficiently agile, both in its staffing and its governance and council committees, to be sufficiently agile to react promptly? Does it pose questions about frequency of meetings and the flow of information?
There will be a role for, I guess, post-election now, post-May, for whoever is the administration at that point to act quickly. That will be both responsible to me to make them act quickly, but also responsible on them to consider proposals and then look at how they then take that through into a budget setting process into February next year, around setting a budget for that point that will keep this council in a position whereby it is sustainable. We've got risks and actions in place around sustainability, both environmental and financial, and those will stay in place, and there will be a key thing to be considering to make sure that this council continue in its current form to deliver the service it wants to deliver. But there will be a need for some tough decisions.
Any further questions at all?
Is it live? Thank you.
Off.
Apologies, I've lost the reference to the exact name of the paper, but by July, the Department for Levelling Up and so on will require a paper on value. Is there a steer on what they'll do with that paper? Is this just a piece of information that you must submit, or do you think it might prompt further inquiry and budget cuts and real impact?
We haven't yet seen any details of what that will be required to be permitted as part of that. As part of that announcement, there was also the setting up of a new part within the department to support local government efficiency. There has been some pushback from some of the groups that represent local authorities to say this is unnecessary. We know the problems we face. We know what we're doing, and it's more work when we could be focused on work on other things. So I think the push will be to kind of keep that structured and as kind of short as possible to give government what they need. But I'm sure there is an intention for government to help use that to support local government in general to be more efficient. I guess wait and see to see how well that is achieved. But obviously, the more work in actually collating it in the first place is not going to be a desirable thing we want to be doing. When I'd much rather focusing on how we actually focus on our budgets and what we need to do as a council.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thanks. One from myself at this point, just looking at the financial risks and the measures there. I suppose it's just particularly on the low risk areas, obviously not the ones that are of prime concern, but we currently have them down as 0%, I suppose, consideration in terms of financial impacts and how we then save against that. I'm just wondering if we have any historical data on those lower risks occurring and being realised or actualised in any form, and whether there's been any consideration of attaching some financial value to them in future.
So as part of the quarterly monitoring reports, we do keep track of the financial impact of the financial risks. And in general, we do okay at kind of getting the total amount we forecast probably more than what the actual risk transpires to be. And I guess we'll have low risk that actually turns to happen, and we'll have high risk turn not to happen. That's the nature of risk, really. So I think the process works quite well. It's not perfect because you can't predict risks. That's the nature of them. So I think overall, yes, we do monitor that from watching the quarterly reports, and at year end we'll show you what the actual result has been. So I think to answer your question, yes, the process works, and I think it works having that 0% in there for the low risks, and therefore the knock-on percentages for the other level risks as well. So yes, it works, I think, at the moment.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from the committee? Oh, yeah, go for it.
Sorry, there was something I should have flagged when I was presenting the report. There's one other adjustment you obviously need to make. Following the council decision last week, we haven't got an allocation in there for the inflation on member allowances. I appreciate that was a long debate on Thursday night, but we need to add that into the forecast. There will be an adjustment to this as we go through both. Well, it won't be just for the cabinet, but then by the time we get the final council papers, we need to adjust for that decision, because that is, there is a financial impact to that. And also, just in accordance with the last report, I propose that we do slightly change this recommendation as well to read: the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee provide comments and recommend to Cabinet, then that Cabinet, and then the long list of recommendations that go both to Cabinet and then to Council.
Thank you. Do we need to add anything further into the recommendations to cover the point you were making there on that adjustment, or would that be captured as part of the process?
I will refer to that at Cabinet, or ask the exec terms to refer to that at Cabinet, and then ask the Cabinet to make the recommendation that we adjust that in time for the council meeting.
Brilliant. Thank you. Shouldn't have to change that. It's good. Right. So on that basis, the recommendations that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee provide comments and recommend to Cabinet that Cabinet approves a decrease in the 2023-24 working budget of £301,000 as detailed in Table 7, that Cabinet recommends to Council that it notes the position on the collection fund and how it will be funded, notes the position relating to the general fund balance, and that due to the risks identified, a minimum balance of £2.48 million is recommended, notes the net revenue savings that are likely to be required in future years, combined with the Chief Financial Officer's Section 25 report, Appendix D, which provides a commentary on the risks and reliability of estimates contained in the budgets, approves the revenue savings and investments as detailed in Appendix B, approves a net expenditure budget of £20.265 million as detailed in Appendix C, approves a council tax increase of 2.99%, which is in line with the provisions in the medium-term financial strategy. Can I have a proposer? Thank you, Councillor Thomas. And could I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Plater. We'll move on to debate. Is there any debate from the committee at all? I'm not seeing any debate, so can we please move to the vote?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. Move on to item 9, possible agenda items for future meetings. It's our regular final item. We've had suggestions previously raised. Councillor Hone, obviously last time you did raise about other risk items, and I know you've raised Churchgate previously in the past, and those have been noted for potential future agendas. I wonder if there's any other elements people would like to raise at this point for future consideration. particularly those that aren't included on the sort of yearly calendar. Councillor Hone.
Do we need to monitor very closely the two new contracts we're going to have in place, which are substantial, which is the leisure and waste, and perhaps looking at the details of those. Not that we're going to change them because it's not our decision, but to see what the details are so we understand the impact which that will have on the pot.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as we've got quite a lot of investments in relation to leisure, as well as the actual contract itself, and we can probably do some more work as we look at the monitoring of that during next year to make sure we're kind of providing you that bit more information than just what might naturally come through the revenue monitor reports. Yeah, happy to look at how we can provide that information.
I think definitely relevant given the discussion on item 8 there. Those potential effects definitely feels like the right thing to be looking at. Obviously, again, like you said, Councillor Hone, it's not so much on the decision itself, but those future effects once we understand the full implications. So yeah, I definitely think that's one to take forward. Any other items from the committee that they would like taking forward on future items? Nope. Okay. In which case, that's the conclusion of business for tonight. I'll close this meeting. The next meeting of FAR is currently scheduled for Wednesday, the 13th of March, 2024. And we'll conclude this meeting at 8:42. Thank you, everyone.